When the battery warning indicator light comes on, that's just letting you know that there's a problem in the charging system. And as you just heard, the alternator is making a whining noise. So I think it's safe to say that the alternator needs to be replaced. To do that, the first thing you need to do is disconnect the negative battery terminal. You'll need a 10mm wrench for this. You remove the cable and set it aside. Next, we need to remove the serpentine belt from the alternator pulley. To do this, you'll need a ratchet with a 15mm socket. Now here's what the tensioner looks like with the belt removed. You place the socket on the tensioner pulley bolt and rotate it clockwise. This will relieve the tension on the belt and allow you to remove it. Also, you'll want to take note of how the belt is routed. If you need to, just draw yourself a diagram. Next, you'll need to disconnect the wiring from the alternator. There's one plug in the back and one post on the top. You disconnect the plug in the back by sliding the locking clip, and then use the tip of your thumb to push the release button and then pull to unplug it. Next, you'll need to remove the plastic cover to access the terminal post. You'll need a 13mm to remove the nut. You'll want to keep the nut just in case the new alternator doesn't come with one. So now it's time to unbolt the alternator. The alternator has 3 bolts. The 2 bolts in the front require a 16mm. The outer bolt you can get with a ratchet and a socket. The bolt towards the center I wasn't able to get with a ratchet because I chose not to remove the reservoirs that sit on top of the radiator. So I had to use a wrench instead. If your wrench isn't long enough or you don't quite have the pulling power to break a bolt loose, you can take a second wrench and you can hook the box end onto the open end, and that'll give you more leverage to pull. That's what I got to do here. Now unbolt the top bolt using a 13mm. And now it's ready to remove. You'll probably have to rock it back and forth to free it from the accessory bracket. All right, we've officially reached the halfway point. And it goes back together in the reverse order. Now, place the alternator on the accessory bracket and install the bolts. Now, I like to get all the bolts started before I begin tightening. You may have to wiggle the alternator back and forth to get the front 2 bolts started. Also, you may have noticed that not removing the reservoirs has made the job much more difficult. Once the bolts are tight, you'll need to reconnect the wiring. And push the plug back onto the alternator and give it a slight pull just to make sure that it's fully connected. And once it is, just slide the lock back in place and reconnect the wire on the top post. The new alternator actually came with the new nut, so I used, surprise, surprise, so I used the new one and threw the old one away. Be careful when you tighten this. It needs to be tight, but don't crank down on it. All right, the next is the hardest part of the whole ordeal, and that's reinstalling the serpentine belt. Now, if the reservoirs were out of the way, it would have been a whole lot easier, but me and my stubbornness, I just refused to remove the reservoirs. And there's a reason behind that. And well, the reason is I had replaced the water pump, and you got to remove the reservoirs to do that. And then later on, I actually blew the radiator. One of the tanks on the side, the plastic tanks on the side, split, and the Jeep ran hot, and it created a lot more damage than what I realized at the time. So I had to replace the radiator, which meant the reservoirs had to be removed. And I didn't make it probably a mile down the road, and it was running. It started running hot. I thought, okay, well maybe the thermostat got damaged in that. So removed the reservoirs again and pulled everything apart and got to the thermostat and replaced that, and put everything back together, and that didn't fix it either. And I ran a compression check, and it turned out that when it had gotten hot, it had warped a cylinder head and had blown a head gasket on the passenger side. So anyway, so took everything apart, removed that cylinder head, bought another one, installed that, got it all back together, and I couldn't get it to run, couldn't get it to crank, and partially tore it apart, and to do some inspecting and seeing where the driver's side, the cam just wasn't even turning. So I don't know, what was keeping the cam from turning, but it just sheared the little dowel pin off the end of the cam, so the timing gear was just turning. And so I had to pull everything back apart again, which meant pulling the reservoir back off to replace the driver's side cylinder head. So anyway, whenever it came time to do this, I just refused to remove the reservoirs. I mean, I was part of the way into it, trying to get the belt back on, and I almost just threw in the towel and removed the reservoirs just to make it easier, but I held firm, and I got the belt back on. So, woohoo! Okay, with the belt finally back on, it's time to reconnect the negative side of the battery, and then make sure everything's out of the way. Make sure you didn't leave anything behind, any tools behind, and then crank it up and make sure nothing flies off of it.